We live in an age of acceleration. Everything is designed to be faster, more efficient, more instant. Meals arrive in minutes, packages in hours, messages in seconds. And yet, for all this speed, we have never felt more restless. Maybe that is why a quiet trend has begun to grow, one that seems at first almost laughably simple. Grandma hobbies, knitting, embroidery, baking bread from scratch, piecing together puzzles, pressing flowers, sewing, quilting, crocheting, slow, tactile, intentional acts. The kind of hobbies we associate with another time, the kind of hobbies we never imagined would return. And yet here they are, resurging among a generation raised on screens. Why? Because these hobbies offer something our modern world has stolen: presence. When your hands are busy with thread and yarn, your mind is invited to rest. When you wait for dough to rise, you're reminded that life cannot be rushed. When you place puzzle pieces together one by one, you practice patience, you practice noticing, you practice being. In a world of infinite scrolling, grandma hobbies ground us in the tangible. They pull us out of the abstract blur of notifications and back into the textures of life. Wool between fingers, the smell of bread baking, the soft resistance of fabric under a needle. These are not just activities. They are rituals, rituals that return us to our senses. Rituals that remind us we are bodies, not just minds. We are here, not just online. But there is something deeper too. Grandma hobbies connect us to lineage, to memory, to the hands that came before us. When you knit, you join a thread that stretches backward, to mothers and grandmothers, to ancestors who created out of necessity but also out of love. Each stitch is a whisper across generations. Slow down. This is how life was once lived, and maybe this is why young people, exhausted by endless digital demands, are rediscovering these old ways. Because they carry wisdom we have forgotten. That slowness is not waste. That repetition is not boring. That imperfection is not failure. That creating without an audience is still meaningful. Think of how radical this is today. In a culture where everything is posted, shared, performed, these hobbies ask for no validation. No likes, no comments, no algorithms, only the quiet satisfaction of making something with your hands. And in that simplicity, something sacred is returned. Of course, the world still calls them grandma hobbies, as if slowness belonged only to the past, as if patience were outdated. But perhaps it is not nostalgia, perhaps it is evolution. Perhaps the future is not found only in speed, but in remembering how to be human again. When you knead dough, you are not wasting time, you are reclaiming it. When you knit a scarf stitch by stitch, you are weaving calm back into your life. When you embroider patterns, you are stitching beauty into an age that forgot how to notice. This is why these hobbies matter. They are not escapes. They are acts of resistance. Resistance against distraction. Resistance against disconnection. Resistance against the belief that faster is always better. And they remind us of something our grandmothers always knew. That joy is not in the rush, but in the rhythm. That peace is not in having everything, but in cherishing what you hold. That love can be found in the smallest acts, the loaf of bread, the handmade quilt, the flower pressed between pages. So what can we learn from this return? First, that presence does not need technology. You don't need the newest app to slow down. You only need your hands, your breath, your willingness to pause. Second, that art is not just for artists. You don't need to knit perfectly, to bake like a chef, to sew like a professional. These hobbies are not about perfection, they are about process. They are about letting yourself create without judgment. And third, that connection is not only digital. When you take up a grandma hobby, you may find yourself part of communities, knitting circles, baking groups, shared recipes and patterns passed down. Suddenly the hobby is not just an act of solitude, it is a bridge. Because slow creation invites slow connection, and slow connection is where intimacy lives. So perhaps the question is not why grandma hobbies are trending, but why they ever disappeared. Maybe we lost them when we believed life had to always be optimized. Maybe we lost them when productivity became a god. Maybe we lost them when we forgot that making something with our hands is not primitive, it is profoundly human. But the beauty is this: we can return. We can pick up the needles, the dough, the puzzles. We can reclaim the rituals of slowness, not as regression, but as revolution. Because in the end, the point is not the scarf, the bread, the embroidery. The point is the presence. The point is the calm. The point is the rediscovery of what it feels like to simply be here. So let the world laugh at Grandma Hobbies. Let them call them outdated. You will know the truth, that within these small acts of creation there is medicine. That every stitch, every loaf, every flower pressed is a way of telling the noise, you do not own me, I still know how to be still. And in that stillness you may find the most modern luxury of all, a life that feels whole again.